Thanks for joining us for another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, what a difference a year makes in terms of debate about future taxation and spending policies. According to our guest, Dr. Jack Mintz, talk of great reset, massive spending, and taxation plans have been pushed aside. Jack joins us from Calgary, where he is a President's Fellow at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Tony. Pleasure to be here.
First, maybe outline this change of thinking that's going on from Great Reset to tax cuts. What's driving this?
Well, I have to admit, when I was involved in a number of discussions just at the time of the pandemic, people were already talking about the need for making big changes, bringing in guaranteed annual incomes, expanding healthcare to include dental care, pharmacare, long-term care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, a lot of spending plans in mind. And then people were saying, well, we created this big deficit and huge debt, and we're going to have to pay that back. And we're going to have to increase taxes, and there won't be enough money for governments to spend. And so more spending and more taxation was basically what people were thinking about at that time. Well, 2 years later, I think we have a reset in thinking. We now have, first of all, governments are flushed with money because of inflation. Inflation has put a lot of tax dollars into the government's coffers, and I'm talking about around the world, not just in Canada. And so as a result, governments actually are not really in serious trouble of having to pay back the large deficit. In fact, what's happened, of course, is that people are paying for that deficit through higher prices and inflation that's created by printing money, and so they are already covering that cost through inflation. At the same time, because of inflation and also higher energy prices, and food prices, we are seeing that people are having a tough time, especially those in middle income groups and other vulnerable situations where their incomes aren't rising as fast as prices are for things that they buy, and they're feeling squeezed. And so one way in which governments can help, of course, is to cut the taxes that people are facing, and we're starting to see that around the world, where we're seeing reductions in value-added taxes or fuel taxes, to reduce energy costs, or we're seeing actually general tax reductions to help people cope with the higher inflation today.
Yeah, and I do want to get to those in a little bit more detail, but just as a sidebar, I'm glad you mentioned the guaranteed annual income thing, because that was all the big push from progressives and leftists that we all needed a guaranteed annual income. Of course, after society shut down during COVID, we basically had that for many different groups of people. It didn't really work out too well. Maybe comment on that a little bit.
Well, actually, it really shows what happens when you try to make things a little bit too liberal. You had people that decided not to work because they could collect their CERB or whatever benefit that they were getting. And then, of course, when the economy was recovering and people were still in these benefits, they didn't want to quickly run back to working, although in some cases people were scared. They still had health concerns and worried about getting COVID.
Right.
And there's still people like that today. But certainly it is shown that when you give free money to people and it's large enough, and if you have a choice, let's say, especially working part-time versus taking the money and living on that instead, it's obvious what's the better choice, and that is don't bother with part-time work.
Exactly. So I do want to talk a little bit about what's happening around the world, because Canada is not an island in this, although we seem to be a little bit behind the times in some of the debate. We've got about 30 seconds left, so we'll just start the discussion now, but maybe give us a state of the debate on taxation versus, these reset theories in the UK and Germany and elsewhere.
Well, I think what's happened in the UK is that the Johnson government actually raised taxes, I think in anticipation of the need for them. For example, raising the corporate income tax, as well as getting rid of indexation for the personal income tax and increasing payroll taxes. And actually, Liz Truss, who just got elected as the leader of the UK government, is basically going to reverse a lot of that.
We were just talking about the international scene where these debates are playing out on taxation versus, what I would call and what you would call overspending. You mentioned the UK. I think you've also studied what's happening in places like Korea and Germany. Is there a trend happening here?
Well, I think there is a concern about trying to get back growth and dealing with inflation, because one way of trying to bring down inflation is to try to get the economy to supply more goods and services. And so what's happening is that some governments are looking at actually trying to improve the investment climate, because that's a way of trying to get more supply into the economy. Some governments are trying to give money back to individuals, and cutting taxes actually is probably one of the better ways of doing it, rather than just giving out demo grants, because that could also encourage work supply and savings. So we are seeing different responses, but I think what's happened is that there's been a real need for government to lessen the burden on the population rather than increasing it.
Right. Okay. Why isn't this happening more as a public policy debate in Canada right now, do you think?
Well, I think it's there. In fact, we already are starting to see provinces doing exactly that. Several of the provinces have been cutting their fuel excise taxes because of the higher energy prices. I think they are concerned about food inflation and other things. And so they're looking at providing some sort of relief to households, and they have been doing that. What hasn't really caught on yet is the need for more investment in Canada. Investment record has been actually quite poor in Canada since 2015. It's been very well noted that we've actually had one of the worst records amongst OECD countries since 2015 in terms of investment. There has been a pickup in investment lately, which is good news, but we have a long way to go. And I think we need to think a lot more in terms of what policies we can have that could encourage businesses to expand their production, and then that will, of course, help deal with inflation too.
Do you think that there's anything on the horizon that can increase that kind of investment? I note the recent rate hike from the Bank of Canada. Is that part of the equation, or is it going to take more public policy than just monetary policy?
Well, the rate hike actually is going to hurt investment, because investment really depends on two major factors. One is what businesses anticipate will be demanded in the future, and they're going to be worried about interest rate hikes causing demand to fall, and that will actually decrease investment. But also, a higher interest rate will increase the cost of capital, in that it's more expensive to borrow from the market, and that will also reduce investment. So you're really getting a double whammy when it comes to investment. But I think there are bigger issues that have played a role since 2015, and that's been especially our regulatory environment, which I think has particularly suppressed investment. And we especially see that in the energy sector, where the impact of Bill C-69 has been to really put a pale on investments in oil and gas and other energy sectors. And I think what people don't understand, it's also going to impact even clean energy projects down the road, to the extent that these things will be viewed upon as having an impact on whatever factors, because the legislation is so clumsy and the approach is so clumsy now that it really needs to be fixed.
Do you see more pressure then to develop our natural resources? I note obviously the recent trip by the Chancellor of Germany, and it did excite a little bit of debate about whether Canada is doing anything to resolve a heating and energy crisis in Europe.
Well, I think the sad part of it is that Canada's just not there. We have tremendous resources in terms of oil and gas, traditional energy, that is being sold right now. Over almost 95% of it goes to the United States, because we have very little access to other countries, although that will partly change when the TMX pipeline is finally completed. And we've had no LNG plants operating, and one will get completed in the next couple of years. But we basically have shut ourselves off from the international market outside the United States in terms of exporting oil and gas. But then even on clean energy like hydrogen and other things, those things are going to come from uh, particularly the people that are involved in energy markets today in terms of their ability and scientific ability, technical ability. That's what we're going to have to leverage off. And we can actually make a very significant contribution to the rest of the world in terms of technologies and new products, whether it's carbon capture and sequestration and associated things like
Right.
that, hydrogen, et cetera.
Sure. We're going to take another brief break with our guest. Welcome back. We're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Jack Mintz from the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. Jack, concomitant with tax reductions usually is more of a push to balancing budgets. Is that sustainable, politically or otherwise, in Canada, do you think?
Again, it is the case that, of course, how much taxation governments are going to need will depend on what their spending is. And of course, if they are more careful with their spending, then they could provide more tax relief for the population. We have to remember that actually the typical amount of revenue that governments needed as a share of GDP back in the 1960s was like 30%. And even when we introduced new programs like Medicare and a number of others at that time, like kind of the pension plan, et cetera, that that ratio did move up, but it's never really gone over 40% in Canada until recently, actually, when it's actually now around 42%. In fact, it even hit 48% at the time of the pandemic, but that was exceptional circumstances. But I do think that we have to ask the question, like, how much government do we need to really deal with what people require, and of course that will determine how much tax revenue is needed. So my view is that taxation has actually gone probably a step too high, and we need to start thinking of paring back some of the things that governments do, because they get involved with an awful lot of things, and some of it is actually quite ineffective what they're doing, and probably those programs could be cut back or eliminated altogether.
Gotcha. What is the best tax reduction policy for Canada then, do you think?
Well, that's actually an interesting debate. I mean, we've seen the Conservative government back in 2006 saying, the GST rate was too high and we should cut the GST rate, which they did do from 7 to 5%. GST is not perfect, but one can also argue that taxing consumption is less harmful to the economy compared to some other taxes. And the ones that have been particularly harmful is a personal income tax. My friend Bev Dalby at the University of Calgary has estimated, that the highest marginal cost of raising $1 of taxes is associated with the personal income tax today, even more than the corporate tax, which is quite interesting. And that's because the marginal tax rates have gone up so high in Canada. And that has a huge impact, not just for high income people and its impact on innovation and investment and et cetera, but it also has very significant impacts even on lower income individuals, because they not only get hit by high personal income taxes or by personal income taxes as well, but they also get slammed by income tested benefits. So if they earn an extra $1 of income, they lose some of the benefits they receive. So if you take like a person who's elderly, they may be paying a personal income tax rate of 25% on an extra $1 of income, but they might lose 50 cents on every $1 of income in terms of their guaranteed income supplement, which is a total tax rate of over 70%. And that is actually even higher than even the richest people pay. So I think we really need to start looking at that balance. And I noticed that Pierre Polyev in one of his videos has made a really big or has a big discussion around meters, marginal effective tax rates, which is exactly that point that many economists have talked about for a number of years.
Yeah, I saw that video as well, and it was extraordinary in a couple of ways. Mostly for me, that actually he was able to articulate in layman's terms, a kind of a complex taxation issue. Were you impressed by that as well?
Well, yes, I actually love the video, especially when he started off talking about parking
Yeah.
meters, and this is a different meter than he's talking about. But with a parking meter, the longer you park, the more money you have to put into it. And what he talked about was the meter on work as being one in which the more work you do, the more taxes you have to pay. And I thought that was an interesting way of doing it. In fact, it's such a neat video. I might try to use it for a class sometime when I'm teaching actually marginal effective tax rates, because it was quite brilliantly put together.
We're going to continue our discussion, Jack. Obviously, there's a lot going on out there, not only in Canada, but with our southern neighbor, of course, that affects us as well. That'll be the topic of the last portion of our program. So stay with us. We've got another section to go. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Jack Mintz. He's a President's Fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. Jack, while I have you here, obviously one of the big news items in the United States was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called. Seemed to be putting the U.S. in another direction where they're actually spending more money rather than dialing it back. I'd love to get your commentary on that act and what it means for U.S. Policy in the future.
Well, I think we have to look at all the different bills that are being passed right now in the United States, because you not only had the deflation or the Anti-Inflation Act, Reduction Act, or the Inflation Reduction Act being passed, but you also had the CHIP bill being passed, which was another $300 billion in spending. In fact, it was almost equal to the supposed surplus on the other acts. When you put the two together, they balanced at least over 10 years. Although, as everyone noted, a lot of the spending is upfront and the tax revenues come later on. And then we also have had just even recently an announcement of more spending by the federal government, another $50 billion, vis-a-vis Ukraine and some other things. And so, and then we also have the huge amount of money that they are going to do by executive order by relieving post-secondary education students from their debt. And so that's another, in fact, there's estimates that could be almost $1 trillion, depending on who you want to believe in terms of the overall cost of that package. So the U.S. is still in the mood of spending huge amounts of money, adding to the deficits. And of course, they don't want to pay the taxes to go along with it. It's one thing to sort of say, okay, we'll beat up on some large corporations for them to pay more, but they've been really not able to do much on the tax side. So, they are actually heading, I think, for significant difficulties down the road because of that. And of course, that has huge ramifications for the rest of the world, given that the U.S. is 20% of the world economy.
Do you think that they're in a recession right now, or will be soon?
I don't think they're in a recession now, but I think they will be in a recession. I think the interest rate hikes are definitely going to have an impact in reducing demand, and the Federal Reserve is, just like some of the other central banks now, including our own Bank of Canada, fixated on reducing interest rates. The big question, though, is what kind of pressure they'll have to relent if they don't bring inflation completely down, and they start seeing a recession and job losses that are being created. In fact, the Senator Warren, and the progressives are already criticizing the Federal Reserve for potentially their interest rates hike leading to stagflation. As they said, what's even worse than high inflation and low unemployment is high inflation with high unemployment and millions thrown out of work. And so I think that's going to be a huge debate in the United States. particularly since the Fed has two objectives in its monetary policy. One is maximum employment, and the other is to have price stability. And trying to solve two, let's say, objectives with one instrument is a real serious problem. In Canada, the Bank of Canada its only mandate is price stability,
Right.
Which I think is a much better approach to monetary policy.
We've got about 30 seconds left, so this is probably very unfair, but I'd like to take you closer to home and ask you whether you see a change of policies coming up with the Alberta leadership election almost being done.
Well, we'll see who wins, but I think if Danielle Smith wins, which is what many people are predicting, and we'll have to see. But I think we're going to see some really interesting times, as the Chinese would say, because the Sovereignty Act will be something very seriously considered in Alberta. And of course, that might be a real pushback against the federal government. And that will, of course, lead to more tensions within the Canadian Federation.
Well, we'll have to get you back to discuss that. We'll see what happens in that race. Jack Mintz, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I'd like to thank Jack Mintz for, as always, being part of this program. Really good insights coming from the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, and his role as a very important economist in Canada. Lots to consider as we move out of COVID and ensure we've got proper growth without massive inflation. So I hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for watching today.